The cottage at the edge of the forest had always been a place of solitude for Mia. It was her sanctuary, a refuge from the noise and chaos of the outside world. Every evening, she would sit by the window, watching the sky turn orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the trees, listening to the wind whispering through the leaves. But tonight was different. It started with the silence. The wind, which had been rustling through the trees all afternoon, suddenly stopped. The stillness settled over the forest like a thick fog, smothering every sound. Mia stood by the window, staring out at the yard, the air unnervingly calm. It felt wrong, almost like the world was holding its breath. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to her imagination. But as she turned to step away, she felt it. A presence. Something out of place. She quickly glanced around, but the room was empty. The shadows stretched long in the dimming light. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. Mia had just settled into her usual evening routine. She poured herself a cup of tea and sank into the couch, the soft hum of the kettle a familiar comfort. The house felt peaceful, just as it always did, yet the air felt charged, as though something was just beneath the surface, waiting. It wasn't until she went to lock the door for the night that she noticed it. The front door, which she had locked hours ago, was slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened. Mia could have sworn she had locked it when she came in, but now it hung open, just wide enough to let the cool evening air slip inside. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. There were no signs of forced entry. The door itself was intact, just open. She walked across the room, heart pounding, and pushed the door closed. The lock clicked as it slid into place, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt different, heavier somehow. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the wind picking up again outside. The trees swayed, their branches creaking in the night, but as the wind howled outside, the air inside the house was still, the silence deafening. And then she heard it. A whisper, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Her name, Mia. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. It couldn't be real. She must have imagined it, her mind playing tricks on her in the darkness. But when the whisper came again, closer this time, a chill ran down her spine. Yeah. She jumped out of bed, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone, flashlight on, and rushed to the door. But when she opened it, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. Her mind raced. Could someone have entered the house? She checked every room, every corner. Everything was as it should be. Nothing out of place, no signs of intrusion. Yet the fear gnawed at her, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She locked the door again and returned to bed. But sleep was elusive. The whispering continued in the back of her mind, as though it was waiting, just outside her door. The next morning, Mia tried to push the fear aside. It was just her imagination, she told herself. Maybe the wind had caused the door to shift, and the whispering. Well, it was nothing. She was alone in the house after all. She was really running away from her solitary past and a morbid fantasy of returning. But when she went outside to gather her thoughts, to clear her mind with a walk through the forest, she felt it again. That strange sensation of being watched. As she walked through the trees, the familiar sounds of the forest seemed muted, like the world was holding its breath again. Then, in the distance, she saw something. A figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. For a moment it was nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the light. But then it moved. Slowly, too slowly. Her breath caught in her throat, It was too far to see clearly, but she could make out the outline of a figure standing motionless, watching her. She took a step back, but when she blinked, it was gone. The forest was still. Mia's heart pounded as she hurried back to the house. Her thoughts raced. What had she seen? Who had been out there? When she entered her cottage, she was greeted by the familiar sight of her living room. But something was different. A small object, something she hadn't touched in years, was on the floor. A photograph. A family picture she had once kept on the mantelpiece now lay face down, the glass shattered. Her stomach twisted. She knelt down, picking up the broken frame, and turned it over. The picture was fine. Nothing was missing. But the fact that it had been moved, displaced, sent a wave of nausea through her. Her head spun. She felt sick, even thinking about it. Something had been in the house, and whoever, or whatever, it was still watching. The whispering came again that night. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Mia. She couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It echoed in the walls, in the shadows, in the very air she breathed. Mia tried to ignore it, tried to sleep, but the fear crept deeper, gnawing at her every thought. She bolted upright, heart racing, when a sound reached her ears. A soft, familiar sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Her voice is soft and laced with paternity, and her voice is modulated and deep, as someone was walking through the house. But when she checked, there was no one there. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. Her eyes scanned the dark room, looking for the source of the sound, but everything was still. Nothing moved. More silence. But Mia could feel it. The presence. And now she knew for sure. It was waiting. Mia's mind raced as she lay in bed that night, the silence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. Her eyes flicked to the dark corners of her room, and though she told herself it was just her imagination, the feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. The house, once a place of comfort and peace, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her. The whispering had stopped after that first night, but its presence lingered, like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. She tried to rationalize it. The footsteps, the whispers. She must have imagined them, she thought. Her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Something was here. Something was watching. The next day, Mia decided to go into town. Maybe the fresh air, the bustling streets, the normalcy of life outside the cottage would help clear her mind. She drove along the winding road that led to the village, trying to focus on anything other than the creeping fear that had taken hold of her since she'd returned home. But when she pulled up to the small market and stepped out of the car, the sense of unease didn't go away. In fact, it felt stronger here. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the shadows stretched further than the walls of her home. She didn't know why, but something about today felt different. The whispers from the night before, though distant, seemed to echo in her ears, making her skin crawl. As she walked into the market, a sense of disconnection washed over her. The people around her were speaking, laughing, moving, but it all felt distant, like she was in a dream, watching from the outside. Mia quickly grabbed a few things, bread, eggs, a bottle of milk, and made her way to the counter. The clerk, a woman in her late 30s, smiled at her, but there was something off about it. The smile didn't reach her eyes, and Mia couldn't help but feel that the woman knew something she didn't. "How are you today?" the clerk asked, her voice smooth but empty. "I'm fine," Mia replied, her voice sounding foreign in her own ears. "Just, the usual." The clerk's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and Mia caught the briefest flicker of something in her gaze, something dark. But before she could make sense of it, the woman turned away to bag her items. Mia didn't stay long after that. The unsettling feeling followed her as she left the market and drove back home, the world outside looking just as strange as the one inside her cottage. "I'm losing you," she thought. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness crept in once again, swallowing the edges of the world. Mia locked the door behind her as she entered the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the silence was overwhelming, and it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She sat down at the kitchen table, trying to steady her nerves, but no matter how hard she tried to focus, her mind kept drifting back to that strange, almost imperceptible feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't long before she heard it again, the soft whispering, so faint it was almost inaudible. "Mia." She froze, her pulse quickening. The whisper came from somewhere deep within the house, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. She stood up slowly, her breath shallow, and began to move cautiously through the darkened hallways. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, a stark contrast to the silence that had enveloped the house. Every room was the same, empty, unchanged, but the oppressive feeling grew stronger with each step. She stopped in front of the door to the attic, her heart pounding as she stared at the handle. She hadn't been up there in weeks, not since she'd moved in. The door was cracked open just a little, and though she couldn't hear anything coming from inside, something about it felt wrong. It felt like an invitation. With trembling hands, she slowly pushed the door open. Her eyes flicked. The attic was dark and cold, the smell of dust and old wood filling the air. Mia flicked the light switch, but the bulb didn't flicker on. She cursed under her breath, pulling out her phone and using its light to scan the room. There, in the far corner, was an old trunk she had never noticed before. It was heavy, worn with age, the kind of trunk that looked like it had been forgotten for years. She walked towards it, every step echoing in the silence. As she reached out to touch the surface, she felt it again, the presence. It was as if someone, or something, was standing just behind her, breathing down her neck. When she spun around, there was nothing, just the shadows of the attic stretching out in every direction. Her hand hovered over the trunk's latch, but something stopped her. The fear that had been building for days intensified, a tight knot in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of the attic, but something else tugged at her. Curiosity, a need to understand what was happening to her. With a trembling hand, she opened the trunk. Inside, there were only a few old blankets and a collection of faded books. She sifted through them, her fingers brushing against the weathered covers. But as she flipped through the pages of one, something caught her eye. A name. Her name, scrawled hastily in the margins of the book. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She flipped the page, and there it was again. Her name, written in the same frantic script. She dropped the book, the sound of it hitting the floor like a gunshot in the silence. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the trunk, panic flooding her senses. The house had been empty when she moved in. She knew it had. There was no one else here, but someone had been here before. Someone who knew her name. The whisper came again, closer this time, and Mia's blood ran cold. Mia. It was right behind her. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the whisper echoed through the attic. It was unmistakable, an unmistakable voice calling her name, yet it was not her own. It was a low, raspy whisper, one that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. He spun around, eyes wild, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The attic was just as empty as it had been when she first entered. Her heart pounded against her chest as she backed toward the attic stairs, her mind racing to process what was happening. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. But before she could turn to leave, her eyes caught something. a shadow moving in the corner of the room, flickering just at the edge of her vision. She froze, too terrified to even blink. The shadow was subtle, almost like a trick of the light, but there was no mistaking it. It was something, or someone, standing there just beyond her sight. She didn't wait for it to reveal itself. She bolted down the stairs, her heart in her throat. The weight of the house seemed to grow heavier with each step she took. It wasn't just the whispering anymore. It was the sense of being hunted, of something watching her from every corner, lingering just out of sight. She slammed the attic door shut behind her, locking it without even thinking. The room fell into a silence that felt more oppressive than comforting. It felt enough to last weeks.
Downstairs, Mia tried to calm herself, but the air felt thick with tension, suffocating her in ways she couldn't explain. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed magnified, as though they were signals of something far worse approaching. The house wasn't just old. It was alive. The walls seemed to hum with something unseen, and every shadow felt as though it might move, might shift into something more sinister at any moment.
Mia tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at her. She needed to be rational, to focus on something normal, something that didn't feel like it was constantly trying to tear her apart from the inside. Amen. She sat down in the living room, the lamp casting warm light across the furniture, and picked up the book she had found in the attic. It lay open on the coffee table, still with her name scrawled in the margins. She glanced down at it, wondering if the book had always been there, or if it had appeared from nowhere. Her hands shook as she turned the pages carefully, her fingers brushing over the faint ink stains. The words, though odd and cryptic, were something she could almost understand. It was as though the language itself had been written with a knowing hand. Something familiar.
Suddenly, the words started to blur, and her vision began to waver. A low, buzzing sound filled her ears, and she could hear the unmistakable whisper again. She snapped her head up, the world around her spinning as the room felt like it was shrinking. Her chest tightened. No, not again. Next.
This time the whisper was louder, more forceful. It came from inside the house. The sound of something scraping along the walls, like nails dragging against the wood, echoed from upstairs. Without thinking, Mia grabbed her phone and called 911, her fingers trembling as she dialed. The line rang, and she could hear her own frantic breaths through the speaker.
911. What's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end sounded so out of place, so detached from the chaos she felt.
Mia's voice cracked, but she forced the words out. Something's in my house. Someone's here. I think I'm being... Before she could finish, a loud bang interrupted her. The sound came from upstairs. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving quickly across the floor above her. Mia.
Her heart raced, and she could feel the pulse in her ears, the rush of blood as panic surged through her body.
Ma'am, where are you? The dispatcher's voice was growing more concerned. I can't stay here, Mia stammered. Please,
The phone line went dead. The room, once filled with the noise of the dispatcher's voice, was now completely silent.
Mia bolted out of the living room, sprinting toward the front door. But before she could reach it, a loud crash sounded from the kitchen. She spun around to see the door to the basement creak open, a dark void beneath the stairs beckoning her. She glanced sidelong at the upstairs hallway, and a hollow scowl spread across her shiny face. Mia stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't heard anything before. The basement had been locked. She hadn't opened it since moving in. Jeff pushed Simon out the door. He struggled standing as feet reached for him, but now it was open, and whatever had been whispering, whatever had been watching her, was now standing at the edge of the stairs, hidden just beyond the shadows. In that moment, Mia realized she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The air felt colder now, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened, stretching long fingers that seemed to curl around her. A cold gust of wind blew through the open window, rattling the panes. She didn't know where to go.
Her mind raced. She needed to leave. She needed to get away. But every inch of her body screamed at her to stay, to find some way to fight whatever this was. But she couldn't do it alone.
She glanced at the phone again. There was no signal, no way to reach anyone. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The shadow moved again. It was closer now, and with it came the whisper. Mia. She turned and ran toward the front door, but before she could reach it, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The slam of the front door echoed through the house like a thunderclap, and for a moment, Mia stood frozen in place, staring at the now closed entrance. Her hands gripped the edges of the door frame, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The fear that gripped her heart wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was a gut-wrenching realization that she was trapped.
The house, which had once seemed so ordinary, now felt like it was pressing in on her from every side, like the walls themselves were closing in. The silence that followed the door's slam was thick, suffocating. She couldn't hear the wind outside anymore, not the sound of the branches scraping against the house. The usual creaks and groans of an old building had ceased.
All that was left was her breathing, quick and ragged, and the cold whisper that seemed to rise from the very air itself. Fear, fear, fear. God, Sinclair has it all the time. Mia.
It was closer now. It wasn't just in the walls or in her head. It was here, with her.
Her legs shook as she pulled away from the door, her eyes scanning the room in a panic. Every shadow, every corner seemed to hold something, waiting, watching. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck rise, like 1,000 unseen eyes were locked onto her, tracking her every move. She had to get out. She had to escape. Her mind raced as she turned to the nearest window, only to find it locked. She had forgotten to open it before, the one window she thought she could use to flee. Panic surged within her, but she forced herself to stay calm, forcing her fingers to work quickly as she tried to pry it open. How long, she wondered.
But it wouldn't budge. The whispering came again, louder this time, almost urgent.
Yeah.
The voice felt like it was coming from everywhere now. From the walls, from the floor beneath her, from the very air in the room. She could feel it pressing against her skin, crawling under her flesh.
Her breath caught in her throat as she finally turned, the room spinning around her, the walls seeming to bend inward. She had to get out. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind her. Mia spun around, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced the basement door, which had opened slightly wider. The shadow was back, moving with eerie precision as it inched closer to her.
For a moment, she didn't know what to do. The only way out was through that door. But the idea of stepping into the darkness beyond it filled her with pure terror. She had no choice, though. The door was the only thing that seemed to lead to an exit that wasn't the walls closing in on her. But just as she moved toward it, a loud, guttural sound came from behind her. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before. A low, throaty growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into her bones.
She whipped around, her eyes wide with panic, and saw nothing.
Nothing but the shadow. It was moving now, shifting toward her, growing larger with each passing second. It wasn't human, that much she could tell. It was something else, something older, something darker. And it was coming for her. The air was thick with the weight of its presence. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the floor like twisted fingers, reaching for her. She could feel the warmth of her breath against her skin, but it was colder than it should have been. She stepped back, but the shadow followed, relentless, inching closer. Wait.
The voice was almost a hiss now, sharp, desperate. It was coming from the walls, from the corners of the room, surrounding her, suffocating her.
She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push back the overwhelming panic. She had to think. She had to get out. The front door was still locked. The basement door was behind her, but there had to be another way.
Her eyes flicked toward the window again. She could still hear the faintest sound of wind outside, barely audible, but it was there. She couldn't hear anything from the street anymore, though. Nothing from the outside world reached her. The whisper came again, this time more forceful, more insistent. Her chest tightened, and she gasped for air, her pulse pounding in her ears. Something was in the house. It was in the very walls, moving with her, watching her. It was no longer an echo, no longer just a sound. It was a presence.
The whisper began to change. It grew louder, more demanding. Her name was no longer a simple call. It was an order. And in that moment, Mia realized that whatever was in the house wasn't going to stop until it had her.
The darkness pressed in tighter, suffocating her with every breath. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, the very structure of the building trembling beneath her feet. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She needed to escape. She needed to run. She wasn't sure if it was fear or instinct, but something took over as her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the basement door. It wasn't the escape she wanted. It was a descent into darkness. She gripped the handle, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she turned it. The door creaked open, the dark stairwell beyond beckoning her into its depths. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run back up the stairs. But she couldn't. She couldn't stay here. Whatever was waiting for her upstairs, in the living room, in the walls, it would find her.
And so, she stepped into the basement, the cold air enveloping her like a shroud. The shadows closed in behind her, and the door slammed shut, leaving her in complete darkness.
In the deep silence of the basement, Mia's pulse quickened. She reached out with trembling hands, feeling the cold concrete walls. She could feel something moving in the dark, something that was no longer a shadow. She reached for the doorknob, tempted to crack it before taking in the scene. And then she heard it again, the whisper. This time it wasn't from the walls.
It was right behind her.
Mia. The basement was colder than anything Mia had ever experienced. The chills seeped into her bones, leaving her shivering despite the warmth of her breath. It was as if the air itself had become heavy, each inhalation filling her lungs with something stale, ancient, and oppressive. Her thoughts turned to her daughter.
The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud, cutting off her escape. She spun around, heart pounding, but all she could see was the thick, suffocating darkness that stretched out before her. Her hands, clammy with sweat, brushed against the rough concrete walls. The space was narrow, claustrophobic. There were no windows here, no way of knowing what lay beyond the tiny sliver of light from the stairs above.
The whispering returned, a soft, low murmur that seemed to swirl around her, like it was coming from all directions at once. Mia froze. She tried to steady her breath, but the sound was so close, so insistent. It was almost as though the walls themselves were alive, crawling with something. Something that was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. When Nia could hold it out no longer, she reached down and wrapped her finger around the weighted metal of the
Mia. The voice was unmistakable now, a distorted version of her own name. It sent a shiver down her spine, and she instinctively pressed her back against the wall, her eyes straining to see through the dark. Nothing. No movement, no shape, just the emptiness of the basement. But the air felt thick with presence.
The whisper grew louder, sharper.
Mia, come closer. Her body tensed, heart racing. There was no way she could go closer. She had to find a way out. Panic gripped her chest, but she pushed it down. She had to stay calm. There was no room for fear now. Not when it felt like the entire house was watching her.
She took a tentative step forward, trying to steady her breathing. The floor creaked beneath her, and the sound echoed in the oppressive silence. It seemed impossibly loud, magnified in the quiet of the basement. Her pulse quickened with every step she took. The whispering stopped. The silence was so sudden it was deafening. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she paused, unsure whether the absence of sound was worse than the whispers. Then came the whispers again, this time, and then she heard it. A shift in the dark. Something moved. Her eyes darted around the basement, desperately searching for any sign of what had caused it. Her mind screamed that she had to leave, that whatever was in here with her would find her if she stayed. But before she could turn to flee, something brushed against her arm. Mia gasped, her body jerking away from the unseen touch. She swung around, but nothing was there. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, echoing in her ears. "Stay." Another whisper came from the dark, colder than the last. "You can't escape, Mia." The words were clearer now, as though they had been spoken right in her ear. The air seemed to hum with malevolent energy, and the darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her from all sides. Panic threatened to overtake her, but Mia fought it back. She had to stay focused. She had to survive. But her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and she saw it. At first, it was only a faint shimmer, a slight distortion in the shadows. But as her vision cleared, it became unmistakable. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the pitch-black void. Mia's breath hitched in her throat. The eyes weren't human. They were too large, too bright, and they seemed to pierce through the darkness, like lanterns in the night. They blinked slowly, methodically, and for a moment, Mia wondered if they were just a trick of her mind. But then they moved. The eyes shifted, floating through the dark toward her, and with them, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. Mia stumbled backward, her hand slamming against a cold metal pipe that protruded from the wall. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles turning white as the eyes closed the distance between them. Her breath quickened as she backed away, the air thickening with each step. "Help me, Mia," the voice whispered again, coming from somewhere behind her, somewhere deeper in the basement. She turned sharply, her eyes searching the dark corners. There was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive void that seemed to swallow everything in sight. And then she heard it again. The growl. It was low and guttural, vibrating through the very foundation of the house, coming from the deepest part of the basement. It wasn't a sound made by any animal Mia had ever known. It was primal, ancient, and full of hunger. Her pulse raced as the eyes came closer. She knew she had to do something, anything. but all she could hear now was the growling, echoing through the walls, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. The presence was close, too close. Mia. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to run. In a frantic burst of movement, she pushed herself off the wall and sprinted for the stairs. The cold metal of the basement door handle met her hand as she reached it, but when she tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. Her heart lurched as she struggled, her fingers slipping in the cold sweat that coated her palms. She heard the growl again, closer this time, and the eyes, they were right behind her now, staring at her with that same unnatural glow. The children picked themselves up, noticing the bodies on the ground, snorting chloroform. Mia? The voice came again, not from the walls, but from inside her mind. She whipped around, but there was no escape. There was no way out. The eyes were closing in. The door remained stubbornly locked. The front door squeaked. Mia's hands trembled as she twisted the cold, rusted handle again, her knuckles white with strain. It refused to give. Panic surged, tightening its grip around her chest. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. The eyes were growing closer, their glow intensifying, as though drawing strength from the very darkness that consumed the basement. A sudden crash echoed through the room, a loud, sharp sound that rattled the walls and sent Mia's heart into overdrive. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, trying to locate the source. Huh? The air felt oppressive, heavy, like it was pushing in from all sides, making it harder to breathe. They argue in the hallway, on their way to the front door. She smiles at him and waves him in. The voice, once a whisper, now sounded desperate, like something trapped in the walls, something begging for release. It was the same voice, but distorted, warped by the raw energy that hummed through the basement. The walls themselves seemed to groan in response, as though they were alive, aware of her presence. A chill ran down Mia's spine. She had to get out, had to escape the growing presence that seemed to fill the room, pressing in from every angle. She turned to the stairs again, her only possible way of escape, but the shadows seemed to stretch, like dark fingers reaching out to drag her back. The air was thick, suffocating, and every step she took felt heavier, as though the very weight of the house was pushing her down into the cold concrete floor. The growl returned, low and guttural, vibrating through the very bones of the house. It came from beneath her, deeper than before. Closer. Mia froze, her feet rooted to the floor. The walls seemed to shift, the dark, oppressive air thickening with a palpable sense of malice. She heard it again, a faint scratching sound, as if claws were dragging along the stone, slow and deliberate. Her eyes darted to the source, but there was nothing to see, just the darkness, stretching into the depths of the basement. Her breath quickened as the scratching grew louder. It was coming from below her, from the floor itself. It startled Philip as the trap door slid open. In the dim light, Mia's eyes caught something moving beneath the surface. The floor, once solid and still, was undulating, as if something was stirring underneath, pushing against the stone. The sound was maddening, like something desperate to claw its way out. "Sor, go it, Mia. Help." The voice was clearer now, as if it were right beside her, but no matter how hard she turned, there was no one there, no one to help. The cold, unnerving feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, overwhelmed her. All she could do was pretend to forget and keep her gaze on the bodies before her. Without thinking, Mia dropped to her knees, pressing her ear against the floor, trying to make sense of the noises coming from below. The scraping grew louder still, the growl now an incessant, blood-curdling roar, like some beast was pushing up from the bowels of the earth itself. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, the only sound left in the room. Mia's breath was shallow, her body trembling from the surge of adrenaline. Her fingers brushed against the cold stone, and she could feel it now, a faint vibration in the floor, almost like a pulse. The floor itself was alive, and whatever was beneath it was not just trying to get out. It was already inside. A sudden pressure on her chest made her gasp, as if something invisible was pressing down on her, trying to crush the air from her lungs. She staggered to her feet, gasping for breath, but the pressure only grew stronger, forcing her to her knees once more. The growl returned, louder than ever. It was as though something deep within the earth was screaming, a sound that tore through Mia's very soul. She could feel it in her bones, in her teeth, in the very marrow of her being. Mia felt me. Her head snapped around, eyes wide with fear. The voice was everywhere now, echoing from all directions. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. Everywhere she turned, there it was, surrounding her, suffocating her, and then the floor beneath her cracked. A sharp cracking sound, like the breaking of bone, reverberated through the room, and Mia's blood ran cold. From the fissure, something long and dark slithered out, its shape indistinct, its presence immense. She could see nothing clearly, just shadows moving in the dark, twisting, contorting, and growing. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice stolen by the oppressive force that held her captive. Mia. "We've been waiting for you," she said. The words were clear now, unmistakable. The voice that had been a whisper now reverberated around her, an entity in itself, something that had been here long before she ever stepped foot in this cursed house. Mia's pulse hammered in her ears as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The floor was cracking more now, long tendrils of darkness pouring out from the crevices. The room was alive, and it was coming for her. And then she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows. A shape, dark and shifting, but unmistakably human. The figure's eyes glowed, the same haunting, unnatural light she had seen earlier. It was waiting for her, watching her with a gaze that sent icy terror through her veins. Mia tried to move, to escape, but her body was frozen. The figure took a step forward, and as it did, the shadows seemed to come to life, reaching out for her. "Help me, Mia." The whisper was now a scream that shook the very foundation of the house. It became a deafening scream, which constituted the sound of the whole house. And then, everything went black. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick, and absolute. Mia's eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing to see. Darkness pressed in on her from all sides, as though the house itself had swallowed her whole. Her body ached, each muscle sore and tight, as though she had been dragged through an invisible storm. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she realized with a start that she was no longer on the cold, cracked floor of the basement. The ground beneath her was soft, like earth, like soil. Mia pushed herself up, her hands trembling as they touched the surface. She expected to feel the rough, gritty texture of concrete, but instead, her fingers brushed against something smooth, almost moist. The air was heavy with a dank, earthy smell, and as her eyes adjusted, she saw nothing but shadow. "Where am I?" She scrambled to her feet, panic clawing at her chest. Her mind was racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten here. One moment, she was trapped in the basement, surrounded by shadows and whispers. The next, she was here, in some kind of tunnel. A narrow, winding passage, its walls slick with moisture, Mia. The voice, that voice again, clearer now, more desperate. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to surround her, reverberating through the walls, vibrating in her bones. The sound was suffocating, closing in like a vice. She took a step back, her heart racing, and that's when she saw it. The faintest glimmer of light up ahead, at the end of the tunnel. Without thinking, she began to run, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to think, but all she could focus on was the light, the escape. The closer she got, the more the walls seemed to shift, moving in on her, constricting the space. The air thickened, growing heavier, and with every breath it felt like she was inhaling smoke. Ostrich reached toward her without standing. The voice was growing louder now, its tone frantic, pleading. "Leah, you have to help me. I'm here. With you." The sound seemed to come from every crack, every crevice in the tunnel. It was endless, overwhelming. She couldn't escape it. All right. Her heart raced faster. She was so close now. Just a little further, and the light would be there. It had to be. But as she approached the end of the tunnel, something shifted. A shadow stretched across the passageway, darkening the light. It was like the tunnel itself was moving, closing off her escape. Yep. The voice was now right behind her, too close. It was more than a voice. It was a presence, something that reached out and wrapped itself around her, seeping into her very soul. She spun around, but there was nothing. Just shadows, empty space. A faint scratching sound echoed from the walls, then from the ground beneath her feet. It was as though something was coming, something large, heavy, and relentless. Mia tried to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The air was thick with a sense of dread, an inescapable pressure. She could feel it now. A presence, a weight, something following her. Something that had always been there, waiting, watching. The tunnel began to shake, the walls shifting and warping, as though the very earth beneath her was alive. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. She had to get out, she had to run. But the tunnel was no longer just a passage. It was a labyrinth, a maze that twisted in on itself, folding in and out of reality. The walls closed in, and the air grew colder, the shadows darker. Mia. The voice was behind her, now louder than ever, and she felt it. A cold breath on the back of her neck, like something was right there, just out of sight. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. But the moment she did, the tunnel shifted again. The walls lurched forward, and she was falling into nothingness. Her scream echoed in the darkness, but it was swallowed whole. The fall lasted for what felt like eternity, her body weightless, her heart pounding. She couldn't see, couldn't feel anything except the terror that surged through her. The tunnel had dissolved into pure darkness, and with every second, she fell deeper, the ground below her disappearing entirely. And then, with a jarring force, the fall stopped. Mia crashed into the ground, her body colliding with something soft but unyielding. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her body was heavy, as if the fall had broken something inside her. She tried to breathe, but the air was thick, as if something was pressing against her chest. "Mia," the voice whispered again. So close, so clear. His mind flashed back. She looked around, her eyes wide with panic, but she saw nothing. Only darkness. It was everywhere. A faint glow appeared ahead of her, barely visible through the suffocating blackness. The same glow she had seen earlier, flickering like a candle's flame, its presence both comforting and horrifying. "Mia, we're not done yet." The words echoed through her mind. She was not alone. She never had been. A shiver ran down her spine, and Mia took a step forward, driven by something she couldn't explain. The light seemed to pull at her, drawing her in, tempting her. With each step, the voice grew louder, clearer. But there was something wrong. Something dark, something malicious, hidden in the words. Briefly, the light flickered once more, then disappeared entirely. And for the first time, Mia knew the tunnel had never been an escape. It had always been the trap. Mia's chest tightened as the darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. Her every breath felt labored, as though the very air was turning against her, wrapping itself around her throat, stealing the warmth from her lungs. She couldn't stop trembling. The cold, the darkness, the never-ending whispers. Everything was closing in. Every step forward seemed to take her deeper into the grip of something far more sinister than she had imagined. The tunnel was now nothing more than a twisted, shifting maze. Each turn led to a new passage, but none of them led to freedom. The ground beneath her was soft, like the soil of a grave, and with every step, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more frantic. Yeah. Her name echoed through the blackness, a voice she could no longer trust. The words were no longer pleading, they were demanding, taunting. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to ignore the gnawing fear that clawed at the edges of her mind. But it was impossible. The voice had changed, become something darker, something far more insidious. It was as though the tunnel itself was alive, listening to her every move, waiting for her to slip. There was no escape. Mia could feel it now. The walls were closing in around her, pushing her further into the heart of the maze. No matter how many twists or turns she made, the path only seemed to get darker, more oppressive. Her savior sat with her. Her heart raced as she stumbled forward, tripping over something in the dirt. Something that didn't feel like earth. Something cold. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against the object in front of her. It was hard and cold, smooth to the touch. She could feel something etched into its surface, something sharp and jagged. A symbol? Her fingers trembled as she ran over the markings, the sensation sending a shiver down her spine. The air around her seemed to grow colder, denser, as though the very darkness was reacting to her touch. The ground beneath her seemed to vibrate, a low hum filling the air, like a distant echo of something ancient. Yeah, the voice was back, closer now, almost like a whisper in her ear. The sound was sickening, pulling at her very soul. She jerked her head to the side, but there was no one there. No shadow. Nothing but the oppressive darkness. Pass points. She quickly pulled her hand back from the object, her pulse racing. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear her way out of the tunnel, but something kept her moving forward. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the voice, dragging her onward. All she knew was that she couldn't stop. Mia. It was closer now, unmistakably so. The voice was no longer a faint whisper in the distance. It was inside her head, in the very core of her thoughts. Her own name, spoken with a tone of hunger, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to break. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift again, as though the tunnel itself was alive, changing, adapting to her every movement. She tried to move faster, but her legs were like lead, heavy and unwilling to obey. The whispers grew louder. Mia, come closer. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. A pull. She could feel herself drawn to it, her mind slipping away from her control, her body betraying her. Some people feel distractions as a gift and a necessary sign of the world moving on. The light at the end of the tunnel flickered in the distance, a pale, sickly glow. For a moment, Mia's eyes locked on it, her body moving instinctively toward it, drawn by some force she couldn't understand. But as she approached, the light dimmed. It flickered once, then disappeared altogether, leaving only more darkness. The whispering grew louder. "Mia, you're so close." Something brushed against her leg, cold and clammy, sending a jolt of fear through her. She spun around, but again, there was nothing. Just shadows. Just the suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Her breath came faster now, her chest tightening with every passing second. The voice was relentless, a constant presence in her mind, pushing her forward. She had passed the brink of extremity. "Mia, we're waiting." The walls around her seemed to contract, the tunnel narrowing until she felt as though she were suffocating in the very air itself. The darkness was everywhere, inside her, outside her, pulling at her from all sides. There was no escape. The ground beneath her feet suddenly gave way, and with a gasp, Mia was falling, plummeting into an abyss. Her body twisted, turning as she fell, her limbs flailing wildly in the air, but the fall never seemed to end. The darkness swallowed her whole, consuming her in its cold embrace. Deeper and deeper into the lake, until she was lost to sight as she circled and spun out of control. She closed her eyes, knowing that if she opened them again, she would be lost forever. Mia's senses were on fire. Her head spun in a haze of confusion, and the cold she had felt earlier now gripped her heart with icy fingers. She could feel it. Something was watching her. Something that wasn't the echoes of her own fear. She could feel its eyes on her, cold and judgmental, as though it had been waiting for her to arrive. She could hear the faint sound of breathing too, shallow and rhythmic, as if it was right behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing. The sound was followed by the unmistakable creak of wood. Soft, deliberate, like a door opening. But it didn't stop. The creaking grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out all other noise. It seemed to come from all around her, as though the very tunnel itself were creaking, as if it were a living thing, aware of her every movement. Her breath hitched as her eyes darted from one shadow to the next, trying to find the source of the noise. But all she saw were the black walls pressing in closer, closer with every passing second. She was trapped. Then, in the stillness that followed, she heard it. Oh. Whisper. "Mia, you're never alone." It wasn't just a voice. It was the very air around her, shifting, vibrating with the sound of it. Her stomach lurched. The words were chilling, as though they came from deep within the very earth she stood on. It was a presence so close, so suffocating, that she could feel it, like a dark cloud pressing against her chest. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on something cold and uneven. Her eyes widened as she looked down, only to see a stone, smooth and dark, like an ancient relic half buried in the soil. Her breath quickened as she knelt, reaching out to touch it, fingers trembling. The stone was warm to the touch, as though it had been alive once, had felt the warmth of human hands before. The words, "never alone," echoed in her mind again, growing louder, overlapping with the creaking of the tunnel, the unrelenting whispers. Her fingers curled into the stone, instinctively gripping it like a lifeline. Suddenly, the world around her shifted. The walls of the tunnel seemed to warp, the shadows lengthening unnaturally, distorting into grotesque shapes. Mia gasped, stepping back in fear, but her feet seemed glued to the ground. The shadows were reaching toward her now, long, gnarled fingers stretching out from the walls, crawling toward her like the arms of a nightmare. She could feel them brushing against her skin, their coldness sinking into her bones. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows were suffocating her, stealing the very air from her lungs. "Mia," the voice returned, now deeper, resonating in her chest, like the echo of a great unseen beast. "You can't escape." Further up, she closed her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest as she felt herself being pulled in all directions. Her body no longer felt her own, no longer felt solid, as though the shadows were slowly consuming her, taking away everything that made her real. In the bedroom, she closed her eyes, silently telling her mind to focus on her. Just when she thought she might collapse under the weight of the darkness, a sharp jolt of panic shot through her. The stone she had been holding slipped from her hand, falling to the ground with a sickening thud. A wave of nausea hit her, and then silence. The shadows receded, pulling back into the corners, leaving only the faintest glow from somewhere far ahead. Mia stood there, panting, her body covered in cold sweat, trembling with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else now. A presence. Something was there, just out of sight, watching her every move. She could feel it in the very marrow of her bones. The tunnel had changed. It wasn't the same labyrinthine passage she had wandered through before. No, now it felt like a living entity, alive with its own hunger. The air seemed thicker, as if it had a weight to it, and somewhere, far in the distance, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Mia spun around, her heart in her throat. The footsteps were growing louder, closer, but there was no one in sight. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't coming from the tunnel behind her, it was in front of her, right ahead. She took a step backward, her feet scraping against the ground, the silence amplifying her every movement. But when she looked up, she saw nothing, just the shadows closing in. Yet, the footsteps kept coming. She moaned when she faced the door, praying she wasn't waking him. His hand cupped her shoulders, pressing them against her back. Closer, closer. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, denser. She could feel it now. A presence just on the other side of the darkness. A figure, standing there, waiting. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body was paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped, and then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, its shape indiscernible in the dim light, but Mia could feel its presence like a weight pressing against her chest. The air around it felt cold, colder than the tunnel had ever been. And then it spoke. Her name, soft and drawn out, as though it had been waiting to be said for centuries. No. Before she could react, the world around her shattered into fragments of sound, whispers filling the air, and everything went black. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness enveloped her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the cold stone beneath her. The whispers had grown louder, not just in her ears but in her mind, repeating her name over and over, drowning out all other thoughts. Mia, Mia. The voice was no longer just an echo. It was in her head, circling her thoughts like a predator, suffocating her sanity. Her eyes darted across the dark space, but the figure remained a vague silhouette in the shadows, its shape distorted by the shifting darkness. Mia couldn't tell if it was a man or a monster. All she knew was that it was coming closer, its presence growing heavier, suffusing the air with an undeniable malice. Mia. It spoke again, and this time it wasn't just a voice. It was a command, cold and unyielding. Garanly. She took a step back, her legs trembling, the stones scraping beneath her feet like nails on a chalkboard. But as her foot lifted, something shifted beneath her, and the ground beneath her cracked. She stumbled, falling forward, and in that moment, the figure lunged. A sharp, piercing pain shot through her side as something cold wrapped around her, dragging her downward. Her breath came in ragged gasps, panic clawing at her throat. She reached out, grasping for anything, but her hands found nothing but empty air and the cold, slick walls of the tunnel. My stomach heaved, she thought. Yeah, the voice had changed. It was no longer cold, no longer commanding. Now it was suffused with something else, something far more sinister. It was a whisper of understanding, of recognition, and something that scraped at the very edges of her soul. She fought against the pull, her hands desperately trying to find purchase on the rough stone. But there was no escape. Whatever held her was strong, its grip tightening with every passing second. And then she felt it. A soft breath against her ear. You belong to it now. The words chilled her to the bone, and before she could react, the world seemed to tilt. The ground beneath her shifted, the walls closing in, and she was falling, tumbling through the blackness. She reached out, her fingers grazing something, anything. But there was nothing solid, nothing to hold on to. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the sound of her heart hammering in her chest was deafening. The fall seemed endless, stretching on and on until it was suddenly cut off. Her body hit the ground with a jarring thud, and everything went still. For a moment she didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. She could feel the remnants of the grip that had dragged her, the imprint of cold fingers on her skin. And then a low hum vibrated through the air around her, a pulse that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The shadows that had surrounded her had receded, leaving her in a vast, empty space, where the air felt thick, almost suffocating. But still the person surrounded her had receded, leaving her in a vast, empty space. She tried to rise, but found her limbs heavy, like lead, as though something was holding her down. Slowly she pushed herself to her knees, her vision swimming as she gazed into the void. It was then that she saw it, an orb of light, flickering in the distance. Small at first, barely perceptible, but growing brighter as it drew nearer. With every pulse, the air around her seemed to shift, pressing in, squeezing her chest. The orb of light was coming toward her, and as it did, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Bia. She turned her head, and in the flickering light she saw only a figure, tall and twisted, its face a blur of shadow and light, as though it was caught between two worlds. The whispers intensified, now more like a chant, an ancient incantation reverberating in her ears. You cannot leave. The figure reached out with long skeletal hands, its fingers so thin they seemed to melt into the air itself. Mia recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. It spoke again, and this time the voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had followed her through the tunnel, that had whispered in the darkness. It was the voice of the entity that had been watching her, waiting for her. You belong here now. You have always belonged here. Chapter 1. The words twisted inside her like a blade, cold and unrelenting. She gasped, her body trembling with fear, with disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But as the figure stepped closer, the air growing heavier with each step, she realized the truth. It wasn't just following her. It had always been with her. The tunnel, the whispers, the shadows. It had all been a part of this place, a part of her. And now it had claimed her. She tried to move, to fight back, but the weight of the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. Her body felt numb, and she couldn't find the strength to escape. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against her skin, and in that instant, everything went black.